for Nishant. Yeah. And now it would be great if we have a little bit more light in the room so that we see also who you are. So please welcome also on the stage. Now we were just randomly seated, but we have Clemens Apprich and Lerone Schultz, Anne-Cécile Worms. We have Volker Reimar. We have Ruth Catlow. We have Vickers, Pieterjan Grandry, and Valentina Karga. I will introduce them each with a little bit more, not too much detail before each of their statements. The round will be like this. We have about 5 minutes per, actually. We have like 5 to 10 minutes per person. Some persons speak together, like you, so I hope you divided it in a good way. And if they use a little bit less time, we have time to bring in also you guys, in case you have loaded up in the meantime with questions. If you do so, actually, you can make your way to the microphones, because then I know that you have something to say, and I will try to let you in as soon as possible when there is an opening in the discussions here. Okay. I think... actually, I would pose one question to Nishant before we go on, and that's how you think, do you think that this notion that you presented of the unintended commons, which for me also reminds me a bit of I immediately thought about the incidentality, about accidentality, and there is a connection there also to kind of creativity as an emergent property rather than something that's very instrumental. So could you say a little bit more about how far can you stretch this notion? How much can you instrumentalize it? Or is it something that is always just there and that you can then study? Or is it something that we actually should try to incorporate as researchers, activists, cultural practitioners in our daily work? How would you see that? Yeah.
Thank you. I was promised no hard questions. Let me see. I think I'll be very brief, and I think there are 3 moves which have been exciting for me in thinking about the question of intentionality. Right? The first is that we do a lot of activism back in India around the questions of commons, both in terms of intellectual property, but also in terms of bodies and spaces and so on. Trying to just negotiate with the rules of the commons is to buy into its intentions to begin with. Right? It's basically saying that these are the people who have decided that this is what can be done with the commons, and all we are doing as activists is just fighting against them and saying, no, we want something else. So it's been very helpful as activist tactics and strategies to stop responding to them in their games. Like if they are playing a game, the rules that they set up are not the ones that we want to play with. And so it's been exciting for us to go to them and saying, no, sorry, this is your intention of the commons. My community, the people that I work with, the organizations that I work with do not have a similar expectation or intention. And how do you kind of give them visibility and validity is something that can be truly operationalized in different ways. And the second was to perhaps go back, kind of just pull back from this Disneyfied notion of the commons that seems to have kind of pervaded a global sensibility. We've forgotten that the history of commons has been a hugely contested category. Both, I mean, I presented one axis which was around gender and sexualities, but also in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of religion, in the kind of things that have been happening in the USA in the last couple of years in terms of walking while black, for example. We've kind of lost the idea that the commons do not exist to be contested upon, but that the commons come into being because of contestations between different intentionalities. And so theoretically, it's been interesting to stop buying into this rhetoric that we know that this is the commons that it exists, and this is what we can do upon it, but kind of flip the mode and saying this is what we do, and because of what we do, the commons come into being. So those might be like two responses in terms of operationalization.
I think this is a very good, incidentally then, point to actually make a transition to Clemens and Oliver, because I mean, I know that you have also, all three of you, worked together in a project on commons and commoning specifically. So it would be good to hear from you. I mean, you both have been active also in the transmediale resource network through our collaborations. Previously as, I don't know what to call it, directors or initiators of the Post-Media Lab at University of Lüneburg. Now actually the Common Media Lab. But each in your individual capacities, also researchers that have dealt with these questions from various points of view. Without giving too much of an introduction, I think you should make your statement now. Thank you.
Okay, then I'm starting. First of all, also thanks for the invitation and hi to the audience here and the live stream. I guess my invention, which is 5 minutes, it's a challenge in itself in some way, is not as beautiful as Nishant's talk here. And it's a little bit malicious, I have to say, because I was really hoping for you, Kristoffer, that you would mention this kind of discourse of innovation in some way. Because you had it also in the pre-email, but then you even had it even more here now to think about innovation. And the thing is, like often if you talk about commons, and especially about the common, is, and also if there's this idea about creating like a critical vocabulary or a language of the common, is that it's in some way in opposition to innovation itself. And I want to challenge in some way this oppositional standpoint, or also this oppositional discourse in that way. So to start with, and also this is like again a repetition, and Nishant also mentioned it a little bit, and also Kristoffer before, but of course there's always a distinction between the commons and the common. I mean, this, a lot of you know that, this is a discussion going on since a long time. We have Michael Hart, Tony Negri, but also there's a very nice book which I can recommend by Jeremy Gilbert, which is called The Common Ground, which just recently came out. And the idea is here that the common itself is always a shared set of capacities, values, and interests, which is the basis then of our creative potential, and of which the commons is the material and also institutional expression. So in that way, the common, and of course also its commons, therefore is an actively, and we also had this, it's always like an actively produced resource. And it's not some kind of only fragile entity that has to be protected against some recuperation or like, you know, bad people or bad interests in some way. Because as Nishant also said, it is really an active resource, or however we want to call it, it is there, it's a lively thing. And as this kind of resource, it also has to be kept alive all the time in order to be not drained by regimes of enclosure. And you also mentioned this, it can be the state, it can be markets, but it also can be communities which are too rigid in their values in some way. As, for example, my research is a lot about the 90s and net cultures of the 90s, where you really can see like an enclosure in these communities, and they really like disable themselves in some way to build up the commons, because there's this kind of discourse in disclosing when it comes to the commons. So, but because of this active component, I would say, of the common and its commons, we should, and especially if we want to build up now a critical language of cultural commons, we should try at least to reappropriate the term of innovation, I would say. And maybe if we do that, we can also try to do it at the same time with creativity, industry, and so on and so on. I think it's not easy to give this away too, too easily in some way, because innovation, and sorry if I bore you now, but this, of course, you know the Latin word innovare, which is more or less, it means to renew, it means to remake. So it's out of this resource which is actively always in some way reactualized as a potential in our everyday life. And so it's always at the heart of any kind or all cultural commons, if you want, may they be shared or not. And I think this is also something what Nishant hinted at, so I think when you talk about the social change, which is actually also in this kind of repository of a common in some way, which has to be actively innovated all the time in the sense that it has to be renewed and remade. So the problem for me is not so much innovation itself, but it's actually for which kind of purpose it's been used for. And there was one, because a lot of thing at the festival I've heard is that, of course, we have this critical discourse and we know things are bad and so on. And we heard a lot of things like this, but I really liked yesterday, for example, in the panel about digital labor, where Schultz actually also had this idea, what about also to reappropriate technologies that have been built for commercial values or for commercial purposes in some way. So his example was to think about Uber in some way. Why can't we build, when Uber is something like a platform capitalism form, why can't we build platform cooperatives out of this, using the technologies, using this knowledge and so on. So the one said this would be a more hopeful approach to the idea about reappropriation and using cultural commons in that sense. So the challenge is, again, it's not so much innovation itself, but the challenge is to find a common ground that allows for mobilizing a politics grounded in the ideas of cultural diversity, social multiplicity, and also radical democracy. So as a resume, I would say that we need cultural commons as an actively produced resource to enable a society of permanent innovation. And this is something which I would really like to stress. It's a permanent innovation, and it has to be a society as an open structure, which is different to the ideas about communities. And a lot of time when we talk about the commons, we talk about communities building up their commons, but I would even like to go one step further to think about the society which actually needs this cultural innovation all the time to become a society and not to be enclosed again in some kind of communities. I think this would be something we can discuss about.
So actually, I would like to ask on that note also if Oliver maybe cares to make a statement on the dictionary of subsumption in this context, because that could be seen as one of these processes of commoning and appropriating the already very contested spaces in which digital culture or urban culture also plays out. So you've been doing this during the festival now, so this would be a good...
Yeah, to link up to that and to the question of time, which I think is doubly or in dual ways acute here or appropriate, because talking about the commons and differentiating the commons and intended, unintended commons and the cultural commons and like making a review of all the festival in 4 to 5 minutes is a challenge, to say the least. But it links very much to the idea that we discussed in the case of Athens and the Greek crisis, that you have some paradoxical things going on in the real geopolitical arenas in which all of these discussions have to be based, which is one of the points I would like to make, that this can't be a universal discussion about the commons and the digital shift in general, but as I think Nishant's talk also has shown, has to be contextualized in political, regional, geopolitical arenas. And one of the paradox things that we found in the case of Athens, where the glossary of subsumption started in a very experimental way, talking about urban enclosures, is that in Greece you have a very interesting situation because of the crisis, everyone now has time. And all of the people in Athens say this is a very valuable thing, actually. And there are a lot of people who return from London to Athens because they think it's more worthwhile being in Athens at the moment, even if they lose their job, because there's something going on which is worthwhile. And that's actually exactly the negotiation and the contestation of the commons in a situation of crisis, which brings in the question of tension, which is another point I would also like to underline in a way, that talking about the commons for me, doesn't make sense if you see it as the tension, just kind of a monolinear tension between the now and the future, which is the discourse of innovation. But you have to see it as a tension in the present between different tendencies. One of them, I would say, is subsumption, or you can also say control society, or you can also say privatization, or you can say neoliberalism or financialization. You can give that a lot of names. And the other one is the political commoning that has to be put up against that. For that you need time, actually, an important resource, which is also subsumed more and more, as we know. So there is this discussion about sleep as the final frontier, which is in a way funny, but also very serious, and as these cases in Athens show. So I would say, to make another point about the question of innovation, that for me, what is also shown in the lead of Nishant is that what we are talking about when we talk about the commons and in the context of the digital shift is the question of a re-articulation of social structures that already exist and that are embattled. And this is kind of, I think, in a little bit to be seen in contrast to a tendency that we have, I think, especially in Europe, in the academic circles, to kind of universalize or theorize or ontologize the digital as kind of a new mode of existence. Because I think it's critical, but it is critical because it asks us and forces us to re-articulate structures that have been taken for granted. I just mentioned here, because we worked with it and he was present in the transmediale, Marcel Mars' work on the memory of the world and the question of the library as a cultural commons that is in question now. And in that point, I would just add the footnote and a question mark to the very question, can we separate the question of the cultural commons from a more general political and social commons? I think the same would be true in interesting ways for university research. When you start to try to sort that into, is that cultural commons, should that be commonly supported, or is it by now a question of economical policy and innovation management, you are a little bit in a complex spot to answer that question. I think with that, yeah, I almost made all of my points, which is great. Oh yeah. Last point maybe to make then is, and that's related to where are we speaking from when we speak about the commons. I think Nishant gave a point of departure which is of course very striking, but it's not really the point of departure that everyone here can or should take. But I think what I would in a little way argue, to bring in some tension with the overall conclusion that the commons have to be unintended. I would here go with Maurizio Lazzarato, who says it's actually not, the commons is not about a question of cognitive reconceptualization that much, of a new theoretization. It's just the fact that someone always invents a new social reality and narrative. And when you have a situation of rearticulation, then those forces are already waiting in the wings, be it the yellow press, conservative, religious fundamentalism, whoever. So if we are not innovating something new and offering a counter offer, then these spaces will be filled, and they will be filled in very ugly ways. But to do that, you have to have a programmatic, a vision, a project of commoning, which is something that you have to intend. And to finalize on that, I would just put the question, doing this kind of post-media lab, common media lab work out of a university, funded also for doing innovation, I would say as a lesson from all of our work that I think in some, the commons will not come out of something else than the commons. So you need a common structure and common resources and common institutionalization in a way, a grouping which understands itself as being part of the commons, be it in the embodied way or kind of this kind of grounded way, or be it in a programmatical way. And there will be no commons done by innovation policy and by competition frameworks.
I think, thank you. I think, thank you. Thank you, Oliver and Clemens. I think that's a very good way also now to go to the next speaker, Ruth Catlow, because now we have covered to some extent a more research and cultural theory perspective on the commons, and Ruth Catlow, who runs the further field, not only website, but also community and network for art and technology and social change in London since 1997. And that is already a space which is has this kind of multi-format, and on the one side a very curated space, but then on the other side very open and existing both online and offline, and nowadays we don't make this distinction so much more, but I think it would be really interesting to hear from your experience also now in another national context also. So Ruth, yeah, the word is yours.
Okay, thank you. The question you posed to help us prepare for this was, how does an independent digital art and culture association like Furtherfield create digital commons? And it's really nice to have such a kind of great provocation and this clear kind of theoretical basis laid out for us, which I'm just going to take as permission to talk about practical things. So I'm going to talk about practical things. And just the headline is, I would say, in answer to that question, is the answer is knowing what you want to do, where you want to do it, and who you want to do it with. So we're talking about commons as an actively produced resource and something that kind of grows and changes over time. And I'm going to talk very briefly about some tactics, strategy, and attitude. So tactics, if we talk about tactics and just coming back to this, knowing what you want to do, where and with who. So the where at Furtherfield has been usually a mix of spaces where we make things and spaces where we display things and spaces where we experiment. Currently we have a gallery in the heart of a very public space, and in this space it allows us to produce encounters between a network of practitioners who are experimental artists, techies and activists, and people who are kind of very connected with what's at the front of what's going on in the front of thought. And then these works gets crystallized into works or events or workshops that are then presented to people who are living their lives as residents, really multiple ethnicities in the area where we are, and the process of mediating conversations there means that there's information flowing back in both directions, and it keeps the whole process alive. And I see the kind of gallery program, both the curated program and the open program that we have, which is through open calls, as a kind of process of exchange and information where we're finding out what is important to most people, and that information flows up to artists and practitioners, and then the artists and practitioners are reflecting and critiquing and kind of presenting this work back. So we have this kind of two-way process going on. We have a makerspace which is called the Commons, which kind of uses this technique, which I see kind of artist researchers using, which is you create a thing or a space, you call it something in order to find out what it is. So we have our lab space, which we have called the Commons, and now we have a reading group, which is about the digital and the landscape commons. We have people who come and run all manner of workshops across a whole set of things. And taking advice from people who've been doing this kind of work for a long time. So we're a very small organisation with small resources and a lot of enthusiasm, both as the engine of the organisation, but these networks of people that we work with. And the way we've managed to do this, and now we're moving into strategy, is to ensure that we have open conversations with people across many different kind of levels of organisation and institution. So we have a very good relationship with the local council, and we've understood what is useful to the local council in terms of we can animate this public park, working with the local people to create something which satisfies something which our local government need to be able to show. So there's this kind of, it's finding shared agendas. And so we have, on the one hand, we're creating these relationships with people who our agendas don't have to wholly align, but we find where these crossovers are, and you know, as long as the people we work with are kind of, you know, we find things that we have a shared values and shared common interest in, and work on those things. And another kind of very practical piece of advice I was given when we were trying to work out how we could possibly resource this kind of community making space in a way that would allow diversity and a really good range of things to happen in there, was someone said, just make people key holders. Okay, so this is a tiny practical thing, and it's really enabled us to do a lot of things, because it means as long as we have careful conversations and work with people that we trust, it means that now we're able to run, we're planning a series of feminist crypto parties. We have the war games, the class war games group who come and do, they work with historic games to understand the politics of various battles. You know, so we just have this mass diversity of stuff going on. And the last thing I want to talk about is attitude. Oh no, but one last thing on strategy. Yeah, very important thing for strategy is, I think, is our online editorial base. So we publish probably about 50 interviews, reviews a year that are, we don't have a kind of planned set of themes. It's very responsive to whatever is going on. And what this does is that it enables anyone who is interested in finding out what we do to really get a sense of what is interesting in the network. So we are identifiable to people. And it saves a lot of time. So people aren't going to come to us and talk about innovation, because it's very clear and I don't mean that what we're doing isn't inventive, but in terms of the kind of innovation dialogues, that isn't what you'll find on our site. So we don't waste time having conversations with lots of people who think we might be useful to them. We have focused conversations with people with whom we share interests. And so coming back lastly to attitude. So I'd say that the things that we have always been interested in are attitudes of play, critique, and experiment. And as an arts organisation, as a small dynamic arts organisation, we can afford to have inconsistent, idiosyncratic, and slightly dangerous kind of public speaking. And this feels really important. It's a kind of, we're modelling a freedom of expression that we also seek to kind of create for other people. So we speak freely in various social media channels in a way that lots of arts organisations would feel uncomfortable about doing, and often provide these channels as channels for many voices at once. I think that's probably enough.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Ruth. Actually, I would like to remind people that you can intervene if you use the mics in the aisles. I think the lights are now again a little bit dimmed, which wasn't the intention, but I think if you line up there also while we're speaking, then I'll let you ask your question or make your comment. I know it's a bit daunting in this setting, but please. Any question is basically allowed at this point. Okay. Actually, we will go from one institutional, or I don't know if I should call Further Field an institution, but we will go to a little bit more institutional setting, but staying within an organization that works in this transversal way on another scale, but it's the Goethe Institute, and we have Reimar Volker with us. Reimar is he's a veteran, I guess, at the Goethe Institute. You've been there since 2005. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And you are now head of the programs for East Asia, based in Seoul. And it will be very interesting to hear what you have to say, Reimar.
Well, thank you very much, Kristoffer, for having me. And I've just taken my watch off to make sure that I don't crave too much of your attention at the expense of my fellow panelists. So I'll try and limit myself to the 5 minutes, of which I have invested 2 minutes in a film that I'd like to show you, a trailer to a project that we've just, we're running at the moment in Korea. So I'll follow Ruth in the sense that I'd like to introduce some very practical aspects of the work that we're doing. Basically looking at cultural commons through the lens of the digital. I think that's how I understood Kristoffer's initial question. So I'll have to briefly contextualize the project that I'd like to introduce you to. For those, I hope or suppose most of you are familiar with the Goethe Institute. So we have 160 institutes in 94 countries. Which obviously is a very large, covers the whole world basically with all its facets, and we do have a digital strategy that we set ourselves, which basically outlines that we would like to embrace all aspects of the digital, both in the work that we do, how we present ourselves, but also how we react and interact to the various environments that we work in. And as you can imagine, they're pretty diverse. And I have the privilege and honor at the moment of working in East Asia, and I found myself when I went there that the European kind of Western notion of Asia as a very homogeneous sort of monolithic entity is quite the contrary. I think there are many different many conflicts both within these countries and also amongst themselves. But there is one common denominator, which is in fact the level of digitization and the use of the internet, which in all countries is quite remarkable, especially in Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, and China, of course, is a slightly different case for censorship issues. But even there, the infrastructure itself is relatively advanced. Korea is a specific point, and I'd like to zoom in on Korea even further, because Korea, as some of you might know, following the 1997 economic crisis, the country invested very heavily in digital infrastructure. So the country was completely cabled. There were high-speed internet access was provided for nearly every citizen in the country. The government also had a very interesting scheme to encourage what they call PC bangs in Korea, which are actually internet cafes, basically. So people were of all ages, of all generations, were encouraged to play games, use the internet. And this is 1997, and nearly 20 years on. We all know there's a gigantic esports sector in Korea. There's a very, very advanced games sector. So it's certainly been harnessed. The internet's been harnessed for commercial activity to quite a remarkable extent, and has been embraced by the population to an extent that it's also quite stunning for someone from Europe to see that people on the underground sometimes juggle up to 3 devices at the same time, playing games, interacting on social networks, specifically Korean social networks like Naver and KakaoTalk. Internet of Things is very, very prominent. You can actually you can shop while you're leaving the underground train to the exit. You can actually sort of touch screens and select the items that will then be delivered to your apartment. I mean, that's not on every stop, but there are some. There's one specific station where that's possible, and the list could go on and on of things that are for us seem quite stunning. There's a very high level of surveillance everywhere too. So nearly every crossing is surveyed, and it's possible to actually access these cameras through social media. So you can actually check your local, practically any major traffic crossing in Seoul by way of social media. So these are all things that sometimes to us are a bit odd. And it's also striking that there seems to be very little, at least in my realm of knowledge and work, a critical reflection on the internet, on smart cities. The previous panel was on Songdo, incidentally, which is one of the few smart cities that's actually coming into being. And it also, for us as a cultural institute, is quite interesting to see that the internet as a vehicle for art, or sort of as an arena for art or critical discourse, doesn't seem to be very prominent, and we find very few artists and intellectuals who actually would see the internet as somewhere where they would, they would engage or interact with. And I've talked to people and asked them why this might be the case, and it's possibly because the dichotomy of online offline that's also been discussed a lot here on transmediale and previous occasions doesn't really exist for most people. The internet is something that is totally taken for granted, and the country somehow sort of leapfrogged this anarchic phase of the introduction of the internet. So it's something like it's an entity or an element that's there and people don't really question. However, it's heavily commercialized. It's been harnessed by the government. There's an agency for the generation of creative content, sort of games content. So there's very little event. So this is where the project comes in. And we've often are approached by organizations that are trying to work non-commercially with the internet. And this was a games designer that a big game designer, so the gaming scene is relatively large in Korea. And it's this company, Norgon, they usually work with large corporations and do motivational sort of big games that use social media and the internet. And they have a strand that deals with literature. And they approached us and asked, we'd like to do a game on Goethe's Faust, and being the Goethe Institute, obviously, it was a rhetorical question whether we would step in and help. And so we developed this game over the last 2 years. And I'd like to show you the trailer. So could we have the film, please, now?
믿음, 자유, 사랑, 성공. 친구를 불러와요? 만약에 친구를 팔아서 사랑을 얻고 믿음을 얻었어. 그러면은 좀 팔다하지 않나? 사랑이 제일 중요하고, 자유, 학문이 중요하고, 진보, 쾌락, 그 다음에 마지막으로 아름다움. 전체 무리가 위로만 올라가게 하는 게 당신은 밀고 있다고 생각하지만 실은 밀리고 있는 겁니다. 그렇지? 이게 뭘까? 게임은 이 책을 꼭 읽고 싶게 만드는 게임입니다.
Yeah, I think I've sort of thrown you a bit in at the deep end of it. I need to explain a few more things about the game, but I just wanted to give you an impression. Basically, what you do is what we did with in developing the game is we distilled the core values out of Faust, the Faust play, connected them to citations from the play, and then what you do as a player is you select your values, the values that are important to you, and then you sort of trade in your Facebook friends to generate sort of money or some sort of tender with which you buy citations in the game according to your values and acquire satisfaction points. And at the end of the game, you see how many friends or images of your Facebook friends you've actually sold and how far you've achieved satisfaction, how closer you've become to your goals. So basically it's also a critique of the commodification of friendship, of social media, using Faust as a vehicle. And it's been very successful. We've played it a lot in Seoul, but also in other parts of Asia and Hong Kong. And we're planning to play it in Japan. And basically, the reaction that our Korean partners often get when they introduce the game is, who on earth gave you the money to develop this game? So it's the whole idea of actually doing something non-commercial and pushing something forward, the boundaries forward maybe of games, or with critical reflection on things like the internet or social media is quite unusual in that kind of a setting. So this is one example of a project that we've done. We've worked a lot with TEDKM. They have an app award that you might know, art apps, yeah. And we found that's also generated a lot of interest, but there's been very little, because there's very little production of non-commercial apps as well in the art field. So that's something we launched. And finally, a project that we did with a fellow panelist here, with Anne-Cécile was involved too, Franco-German-Korean project that we call Digital Peace, where we tried to, we presented the internet as a vehicle for exchange within Northeast Asia. So just to sum up, I think what we try to do, at least what I try to do in the part of the world that I'm working at the moment, is actually to identify and support non-commercial, non-mainstream activities and collaborations to do with the cultural commons and maybe the digital sphere, to provide a platform for artistic activity and to facilitate critical reflection, both bilaterally, that is Germany, Korea, or multilaterally with other European countries, or even between Asian countries. So that's our contribution as a cultural organization to the cultural commons, maybe in a digital sphere. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, thank you, Reimar. I think it's something we can come back to in the discussion, unless somebody has a question about it now. Also specifically addressing digital commons and what a cultural institution can do in this, I think it's good to have this very concrete example. And this jumping between different regions, it's a very global panel. So now I'm going to go back to the UK, although Ben Vickers is also representing in some ways international nomadic community, since he's also very active with the project Unmonastery. So Ben is a curator and writer, and I always like to say this because you put in your bio that you're a Luddite. Maybe you care to explain that at some point. And yeah, he's also currently curator of digital at Serpentine Galleries. Ben, please.
Okay. So my brain's a little bit fried after the last week, so this might be a little bit more structured than others. But I think it's probably important to give a bit of context. But I mean, hopefully, the Unmonastery's done so much over the last week that I hope people might have some kind of idea what it might be, even if we're constantly redefining it. But to say very briefly, the Unmonastery is an initiative that attempts to confront some systemic issues that are related to youth unemployment, the mismanagement of resources, such as empty buildings, and the depletion of state services as a result of austerity. And I guess we do this for a reimagination of monasticism, hacker spaces, open source methodologies, with the hope of kind of redeploying those. And I guess this is kind of, I think of this a little bit as a kind of foundational technology, or maybe a gateway technology on which we could potentially build things. And I'm sure anybody that's spent their lives staring at a screen has contemplated the kind of retreat or exit from society that we try to work through, or maybe it's a reaction to. But part of this panel, you actually asked me a specific question, which I wanted to deal with, and then kind of work into some of the issues that I think have been mentioned, particularly in relation to state and market and the commons. The question was, what are the challenges of organizing decentrally or nomadically in a post-digital culture? And kind of having contemplated this question and considered some of the easy wins in relation to the way that we kind of move across Europe and try and build autonomous networks and build foundations and distribute appropriate technologies. And I guess improve upon the essence of the monastery model as a kind of expression for a greater commonality in governance, resources and agency, I'd actually kind of like to address this directly in this context. To simply say that I don't believe that decentralization can be addressed exclusively as a kind of technological solution, or a strict form of protocol that's articulated by a privileged class. And I guess the reason why I'm saying this specifically here now, me sat on the stage, is because I think this actually representing a kind of collective effort represents a whole set of really complex problems, that the very form of the kind of expert on stage or representative of an organization as the means by which we talk about the commons is kind of deeply problematic, and something that I've become very aware of in the context of transmediale and kind of being the face or the PR guy of the organization. And I just wanted to kind of speculate that there are potentially forms of working or coming together that might be different to this, and that we should make a very concerted effort to begin to iterate on these things, particularly in a moment in which we're trying to express common ideals about the future. And I think this is kind of compacted when we talk about the desire, or we actually generate kind of new forms of knowledge in this space, in order to ensure that those new forms of knowledge exist within the commons, that they should be expressed within a forum of the commons. But certainly as an organization, this has been an amazing opportunity to kind of congregate here and contemplate and reflect and kind of test some of our ideas and have a sense of the urgency of the next steps. And I'm deeply grateful for that. But with this said, in specific relation to the monastery, I'd like to raise a kind of single issue of which we are personally grappling in respect to commoning, that may be useful, and I think that should probably be confronted in discussion of this nature. And it's that fundamentally, in a moment in which we propose that there's an alternative to state or corporate sector control that is capable of caring for, administering and stewarding the services and infrastructure on which we rely on a daily basis, we have to register what this fundamental shift represents. And I think that we're beginning to arrive at this moment, and we really need to begin to interrogate whether we can actually concretely take on such responsibilities, and to kind of internalize the implications and the scale of that responsibility. And in specific relationship with some of the things that have been discussed here and what we kind of do with our monastery is, I don't believe that we invented things such as corporations, the church and the state because we wished this great ill upon civic society. I think we did this because we believed it was a viable way to ensure stability. And I think that there's, and maybe it doesn't relate directly to this discussion, but it definitely relates directly to the context of some of the things that have been discussed, is I don't think that we can reduce our response in this moment exclusively to a critique of those who respond to a sense of chaos in the world through excessive optimization and quantification in trying to find a way through. And I think, I guess my provocation is, and with such a realization, that we should begin to decide what it is we will continue to support and what we will allow to collapse into history, and the components that we will reappropriate for other means and purposes. In doing so, to confront issues of fairness around a reallocation of right to access. And I think right to access is a fundamental question when we position ourselves in opposition to state infrastructure or existing institutions. And specifically in relation to our monastery, we're quite explicitly not a religious order, in so much that no one subscribes to one particular belief system. But we recognize that so much is lost in the moment in which we denounce century-old organizational forms. And I think it's crucial to identify within this moment a kind of historical commons. And why should we begin to try and reinvent the wheel every time we talk about certain subjects, and particularly the kind of startup culture. And in a monastery, we considered if the Benedictine rule or other monastic codes have consistently delivered harmonious collective living conditions for thousands of years, perhaps something to be lifted from this. But I don't believe that it's the only example within history that might be useful for this discussion. And I guess I had another point, but I think it's too heavy, so I might just drop that now. Yeah, thank you.
That's a cliffhanger, I think. We might want to get very happy at the very end, but yeah, thanks, Ben. I think it's nice also to have this conversation reflecting back on what you guys actually all did in the festival, so thanks for that. So now we're going to move to Valentina and Pieterjan, and I have a little announcement to make also before they take the word, and that's actually that Valentina Karga and Pieterjan Grandry are the recipients of the Transmediale and Willem Flusser residency program for artistic research this year. So we decided that, or the jury decided that very recently, with their project Market for Immaterial Value, which you're probably going to hear a lot more about also later throughout the year with the different activities we will have with them. It's a residency program that Transmediale is running, yeah, with the Willem Flusser Archive at the University of the Arts here in Berlin since 3-4 years. And you might also tell a little bit about that project, because it actually is an ongoing project that already relates very much to these questions that we're discussing about commoning, and specifically more from an economic perspective of kind of commoning sources of income. And it would be great if you take the word now and give them an applaud for the residency.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're super happy to be part of the Transmediale network and to be awarded the Willem Flusser residency. I will briefly explain our proposal, the project we proposed, without going too much into the details. So the proposed project is, like Kristoffer said, it's called Market for Immaterial Value, and it's in essence a sort of experiment into creating, co-owning and validating artworks in the area of immaterial production. So the project, it's an online market where shares of an artwork are sold to a public through a public auction. So those interested in co-owning artworks can bid on certain shares. And the current shareholders can then decide where they want to sell their share or wait until the bid gets higher. It's of course quite complicated, all these things, so this is why we are very happy to have the residency as well to go into all these details. But the main idea for this project, for this experiment, came from a discussion we performed during the 4th Athens Biennial in 2013. In which we held a dialogue, which we have very often at home. And this dialogue was triggered by Valentina's mom, who converted part of her life savings into gold because she doesn't trust the banks anymore. So probably like many other Greeks did, they solidified part of their money. So this event triggered with us a discussion about our own financial future. But also the future of our art practice and where it would go, and if the projects we do would ever be fit for an art market or for an established institution to rely on these fundings all the time. So we were curious to see if we could make other systems in which we could rely on ourselves, so that we could do just by ourselves without skipping. And I think this is quite closely connected to the maker ethic, perhaps, of doing these things yourself, and kind of, it's not really an activist point of view of like saying we want to boycott the establishment or we want to comment on it, but it's rather a practicality of it's probably easier to do so.
So thank you also from my side for the residency and for being here today. Peter already told you some things about the project. I will try to draw a few more links towards our topic, the cultural commons. And actually, Kristoffer gave us a really nice task to think about how our project relates to this topic and challenges us to think a little bit beyond our limits and start new conversations about it. So we start from this very, very simple question, like since valuing art is a mere agreement between parties, which rely to very personal things like belief, for example, why can't we build alternative ways of validating art, valuing art, and remunerating the artists that work for it? So our work, in its base, it's actually a system. It's a system for art validation and can be reproducible to others, like other artists can copy it, or we could imagine including in the next phase other people's work in this online platform that we're building. So it is a little bit this idea of open sourcing art validation, keeping in mind that open sourcing has this link to also user-based value rather than simply monetary output. What we're basically trying to do is to create a self-supported framework, a self-supported economical framework. And this economical framework becomes a very basic, like an inherent part of our project. And thinking of the cultural commons as a mechanism for maintaining cultural diversity, we believe that our project falls out of any specific category of the established art practice or cultural practice. So it has several components. There is an actual artistic object. It's a golden coin, which we have already made, but it might change as well. There is this online market. There is the shares, which will be, in form of A4 papers. There is this tactility of the paper, and will circulate among the participants. And there is, of course, public appearances of us talking about it, and so on. So we don't really know what of all this is the art, or if it's just a system or a business model, if you like. And we're also not specifically interested in finding this out, like to name it and to make it part of some specific practice or language that the market or institutions would understand. And we like to keep it kind of, not very well defined, because we think that as soon as you start defining things, then you make them more easily subjected to instrumentalization. So maybe there is a little bit this idea of the annotation that we talked about it before in there. In general, like to conclude, we want to create an alternative of how the art market typically works, which is to fall under the dictations of the alpha consumers of the art world. And we do use money because we think money is a commonly accepted system of measuring value, and it's okay. Yeah, well, we can debate about that. But by starting selling these shares in extremely low amounts, like we will only make them, at the moment we invested like about 300 euros for this artwork, for the gold. It's just the price of the material. And we want to have 100 shares, so that makes like 3 euros each. So by giving it away for such low prices, we want to see if we can shift the interest of art owning to something that goes beyond money. So in the end, like the value of this work that we will create will not is not these transactions between the users, but rather the accumulated value of this social capital of all the transactions together that the project will trigger. And perhaps by adding all these small sums together, we might reach a substantial amount that could be competitive to the typical art market, and therefore we could create a substantial alternative to the only language the art market understands, and that's money. So thank you.
I think that's a pretty beautiful illustration also of what Oliver was talking about, that something has to emerge from the commons, and you set up more a system for that to emerge. And very exciting to see what happens. There was bound to be a glitch this late in the festival, so in my own running order I had it differently from the official running order, and I double confused it. So but it doesn't matter, because the glitch produced a good effect, because Anne-Cécile Worms has, for example, you're a long publisher actually, long time you were engaged in the MCD, a digital culture journal in France, and the latest issue was on money, but you're also yourself writer, curator, that are here today also to speak about the new platform, the Makery. So I'll give the word over to you. Please welcome Anne-Cécile.
Thank you. Yes, for me, the new places of cultural commons are the labs, not only the Fab Lab, but also the Living Lab, the Hacker Space, the Bio-Hacker Space, all those new labs emerging around the world. So with a small team of independent journalists, we decided to create online media called Makery.info, and we are mapping the world, trying to find all the labs we can speak about. So we have more than 500 labs already on our map, and if people here in the audience are running an independent lab, please send us some info, because it's an open mapping project. The idea also is to bring revenue to those labs, because we have seen that a lot of labs are creating, but also some of them are closing because lack of fundings, lack of equipment. It's very difficult to run an independent lab. So Makery has decided not to put any advertising on its websites, but to organize some mobile lab, and we are hacking some huge corporate events, bringing some of the most famous independent lab on different theme. I'm going to show you a small video we did at Le Web. Le Web is a French rendezvous of entrepreneurs, startup, fundraiser, VC, and usually they don't have any makers in the company. So we were invited on some theme. The theme were health, drone, wearables, what they called also now the future of mind, the mindfulness. It's a new trend in the startup environment. So we invited the independent French lab to prototype on site, and on the video you're going to see it's very small teams we invite, and for us the purpose of that is to create business for them. And Makery, we are kind of a common language between independent hacker, bio-hacker, independent lab and corporation. We are not afraid of economic, because we think those labs need funding and help to develop their projects. So I invite you to visit also the website, because you have a lot of interesting featured article on emerging lab in Africa, in South America as well, and women are very well represented in those countries, much more than in Europe or in the United States. So you will find a lot of feature article, and I want to show you the video. You're going to see on the video a guy that has a very small association. He has handicapped. He has an arm that needs a prosthesis, and he has built his own prosthesis for less than 200 €. He has no means to develop his project, and since he went with us at the web, he found a lot of partnership. The idea is that health should be available everywhere for everybody at a low-cost price. You will find also on this video, Fly Lab is a little French lab about drone, and what was very funny is that the whole industry of drone was invited, and they have seen that we can build the same drone for much less money that they are doing. So if we can see the video, then we can exchange on makery.info, and I would welcome also all the journalists that are makers to join us, because we are looking for more people to write, and the idea is we need the journalists that will know the maker community. For us it's very important that we don't speak but we make first. That is also the point of Makery. So thank you very much. The idea of bringing all those labs together, it's also to create collaborative process between those labs who very often don't know about each other, and that's why the platform Makery is about common knowledge, but also how to share this knowledge without any worry about being in Africa, in South America, or in Europe.
Thank you, Anne-Cécile. I think it's now a very diverse set of statements from the very condition from which the commons can emerge to very practical approaches where sometimes you're actually explicitly, like in the case of further field, considering yourself as a site of commoning, and then also to more individual art and platform projects, institutional agendas, considering also different cultural contexts in which technology or digital commons may emerge or not. It's a complex but rich, I think, set of discussions. And we have a first question.